final budget that's up for vote this evening. Salaries and wages are now $115.4 million, and our total budget is about $246 million. So that's an increase of $47 million, which over a 10-year period, that seems like a pretty significant increase over that time. But again, I draw your attention to that red line in the table, contributions to the PSERS system. The contributions scheduled for 2019-20 are $38.8 million versus the $8.8 million from 2010-11. So over a 10-year period, there's been a $30 million increase in PSERS contributions. And again, that's a mandated contribution rate from the state of Pennsylvania. The district has no choice but to pay that rate. And we'll get into a little bit more context around PSERS and its impact on our budget. But I'll just, again, paint the picture of, on a percentage basis or on a pure dollar basis, you look at some of those numbers and the increases are significant. But if you go to that far right column and look at the average annual increase, the numbers are actually fairly reasonable, in my opinion. Salaries and wages have grown less than 1% over a 10-year period. Healthcare, 1.9%. That's actually pretty remarkable, given the state of the healthcare industry. Other costs, 0.5%, 3%, 1.5%. The line item, all other costs, growing at 1.1%. Transportation, much of the special education costs, supplies, books, things of that nature. So that's a very reasonable annual increase year over year. So I'll also point out the line at the very bottom, budgetary reserve. So in prior budgets, up until a few years ago, the district would budget $1 million in the line item called budgetary reserve. And the sole purpose of that line item was to serve as a buffer in the event of any unanticipated expenditures. So you would have that line item in the event that in August you had a section or two increase in your elementary schools and you needed to hire a teacher that wasn't initially budgeted for it. You'd have a buffer there in that line item. I point that out that now in 2019-2020, we're proposing that is zero. So that essentially means that we're relying purely on the built-in conservatism in our estimates for our budget. There's no specific line item meant to catch those kind of contingencies in the budgeting process. You know, I need to back up real quickly. In the bottom left of every slide, you'll see that there's an email address. So forgive me for not mentioning this earlier. That email address is live. If there are any folks who are watching this live on their computers, they can submit questions to budget@crsd.org. We are monitoring that account. We can answer any questions before the conclusion of the forum, in addition to any questions from members of the audience. Okay, so here's a graph of our fund balance over the last 9 years. So you can see there's a couple of different bars. We have categories of assigned fund balance where we specifically set aside money for a purpose. The most common, as I look through these numbers over the last 9 years, was we had set aside some funds to, as the PSERS rate grew, we wanted to be able to have some funds in reserve to be able to help offset the annual increases for that. So that's the most significant darker blue bar there. And then the top blue, the light blue bar, is our unassigned fund balance. So essentially our rainy day fund. Right now you can see that in the last 3 years, the fund balance has declined from about 29 million. It's now at about $21 million. So it hovered between 25 and $30 million for 5 years, which is about 15%, or the high was about 15% of our expenditures, which is right in line with acceptable practices that professional organizations that advise school districts recommend. We're now at about 9%. Still an acceptable level, but we've had some declines in the last 3 years. This chart shows the Act 1 index, which I'll talk about in just a minute. That is the orange line versus the tax increases adopted by the school board every year. And again, going back over a 10-year period. So this demonstrates that the board has approved budgets at or less than the Act 1 index over this period of time. All right, so I said we would get into more detail around PSERS, and here we are. So going back all the way to 2003, 2004, the contribution rate on every dollar of salary was 3.77% in that budget year, which means that for every dollar we spent on salary, we contributed just under 4 cents into the state retirement system. So now, obviously, as you look to the top of that mountain, the contribution rate projected for 2019-20 is 34.29%. So that means that we contribute 34 cents to every dollar. So you see a very steep ascent going up that contribution rate, beginning in right around 2011-12. And if you remember, this contribution rate sort of lagged the Great Recession. So that was to make up for some poor investment performance by the fund because of that recession, but also some legislative changes that were made to the fund. So the other item I'd like to point out is in that nice green box there. So if I take the salaries that are budgeted in 2019-20 and use the same contribution rate that we had in 2003-4 of 3.77%, the total budget here in Council Rock could be reduced by $34.4 million. So it's a pretty staggering number when you look at that. It was an interesting calculation. One more on PSERS. This shows you as a percentage of our budget in 2003-4 versus the percentage of our budget in 2019-2020. So in 03-04, 2.1% going toward our contribution to the retirement system. That number is now projected to be almost 16%. Any questions on that? Okay. So now we're going to transition into the proposed final budget, which again is up for discussion and vote at the board meeting following the budget forum. So I'm going to kick it off to Dr. Frazier here. He's going to give you some context around what we are trying to accomplish as an organization.
Thank you, Mr. Stone, and thank you to the many of you who have shown up here this evening. Certainly appreciate it. It's a beautiful night out there. The fact that you chose to be here is fantastic. Thank you. And to those of you watching at home, whether that be live or via our YouTube channel, we thank you as well. I will remind you again of the email address that we have, budget@crsd.org. As Mr. Stone had indicated, we are actively monitoring that live. So if you have a chance to submit any questions now, that would be fantastic. And if that opportunity comes later, rest assured that we will still receive that email and we will be happy to respond at that time. I want to give a one-slide overview here, really just an executive summary of our 2019-2020 budget. And what I'm pleased to tell you is that we have placed a priority, as we often have in recent years, around security. Safety and security is our foremost priority. So all of our schools, before the start of next school year, between now and then, will be receiving enhancements. I am also pleased to say that in spite of the budget difficulties that we face through mandated expenses, PSERS, and otherwise, that we are able to be fiscally responsible enough to maintain all existing educational programming. This third piece that's on here is actually a good problem to have, and that is our teacher substitute fill rates. This has been a problem around the state and around the county, with school districts not having enough substitute teachers to backfill when a teacher is at a training or is otherwise not in a classroom. So as you can see, last year our teacher substitute fill rate was only 62%, and this year we are just above 90%. So that's a great thing for our students to be able to have that teacher in the classroom. It's also a good thing for our staff. What it does, and this is why it's a good problem, is it does bring some additional expenses to us that we are more than happy to pay. This 2019-2020 budget also reinstates a supervisor of special education position. We have been short-staffed in that area for the past 4 years. We did have to make a reduction of one supervisor of special education with the 2016-17 budget, and we're pleased at this point to be able to bring that position back. We are also very excited about this new K-5 core mathematics program. That will actually be presented, if you're interested, at the upcoming Academic Standards Committee meeting, and then it will be up for formal board approval at the May 30th board meeting. And then from a technology standpoint, we have approached a Chromebook model in the district, a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 students for every Chromebook. And we have also had 2 technology integration specialists at each level. So last year was elementary, this year is middle school, and next year that plan will expand to the high school level. Also from a technology standpoint, we will be implementing a district-wide LMS, a learning management system, at both the middle and the high school levels. That LMS is called Canvas. You will be learning a lot more about that if you are unfamiliar with it at this point. And that will be a great thing for parents to organize your children's work and to communicate with teachers. And it will also be fantastic for our students because the vast majority of our students end up certainly in college, and they will use an LMS while they're in college. So we want and feel a responsibility to give them that experience while they're with us. And then we have the addition of a high school multicultural literature course as part of our work around diversity and inclusion and embedding that work into our curricula. So that's an exciting high school elective addition for next year. And then Time Clock Plus will be a new timekeeping system that we've already started to roll out, but we have not rolled it out across the entirety of the school district just yet. That is to be in compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act and just a sign of best business practice. So that, again, I would put into the bucket of a good expense to have because it will make us more efficient and more effective as an organization. So that's a real high-level overview. Mr. Stone gave you a summary, and now Mr. Stone will go back to giving you some of the details behind this 2019-2020 budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frazier. So we'll start on the revenue side of the budget. This pie chart shows you that we are a locally funded school district. 77% of our revenues are derived from the local community. We get 23% from both state and federal sources. That's common for school districts in the suburbs. We are primarily locally funded. We do not get a lot of state and federal aid. So the table on the left-hand side there shows the components of that local revenue. So the first 5 categories of revenue there are funded locally by the homeowners. And for context, 87% of the tax base in Council Rock is residential. That means that the burden falls primarily on the residential property owner. So you can see in order of significance, real estate taxes being the primary source of funding for the school district, followed by EIT, occupation tax, real estate transfer tax, and so on. The table on the right-hand side are state and federal funds. And in fact, our federal revenues are not significant enough to even warrant being called out separately here. But you see some of our reimbursements that we receive from the state. So we talked about our contributions to the PSERS system. The state actually refunds 50% of those costs. So we will see about $19.4 million of reimbursement come back in from the state on that, as well as on FICA, which is contributions to the Social Security system. Most of the remaining items on there are unrestricted subsidies that we receive. The basic education subsidy, special education subsidy, those are driven out depending on specific student populations. The transportation subsidy is to help offset costs in that department. But I would also point out that there's right in the middle there, a line noted as property tax reduction. So we receive about $5.5 million every year from the state, which is simply passed back to the local homeowners as a credit for anybody who qualifies for a homestead exemption, meaning it's their primary residence. So that's just simply a pass-through. We will reduce our local funding, and everybody receives about a $270 credit if they have that exemption. So So because it is the most significant revenue source for Council Rock, it warrants further discussion around how we arrive at the calculation for real estate taxes. So the graphic on the left-hand side there shows the total revenue of $153.3 million, and that's derived by taking the total assessed value of all properties in the district, so all the homes and businesses. That totals about almost $1.3 billion. That's multiplied by our millage rate, which is at the bottom of the graphic, which is projected to be 126.45 for the upcoming year. We don't collect 100% of all of our taxes, so we do take into account that we average about 97% collection rate, meaning the remaining 3 gets turned over for delinquent collection. And when you take those 3 numbers and kind of combine them together in a calculation, you get our $153.3 million. Separate from that, then you take off the state property tax relief, which is passed through, and that's that last bubble on the far left there. So we also think about the real estate taxes in a couple of different ways. So the tax calculation is governed by Act 1 of 2006, which is a state law that mandates the amount of tax that can be raised by a school district in any given year. So in September every year, the state publishes that index, which then tells school districts what they can use for the following year's budget. So this year, that rate, which will be the maximum allowed under Act 1, is 2.3%. And if we harken back to that perspective graph that I showed you, you can see that Act 1 index rate is typically in the 2% range. It's been as high as 3.3. It's been as low as 1.4. So we kind of float in that range. If we use a maximum tax increase going all the way to that 2.3%, that generates just under $4.4 million of additional revenue for the school district. So in terms of millage, that means 2.843 mils. So people talk about tax increases in different ways. Some people talk in mils, some people speak in dollars, some people speak in percents. So we can slice up that $153 million in different ways. The value of 1 mil, so on that bottom graphic there, each 1 mil of that 126.45 is about $1.25 million. The value of each 0.1%, so if you think of real estate taxes in terms of what percentage increase am I seeing this year, it's $155,000. So each 0.1% that you add to that gets you to that number. So we'll switch gears now to the expenditure budget. So this represents the proposed final expenditure budget for next year. So what's not surprising to me on this particular graph is that we are a people organization. Students and teachers, rest of the employees supporting that work in the classroom. So we have 76% of our expenses being devoted to the salaries and benefits associated with doing that work. So again, with that profile, it's really not a surprising number. It's large, but it's not out of the ordinary. Again, I'll point back to that PSERS contribution that we discussed. Of that 76%, 15% of that is just for contributions to the retirement system. So it's a significant portion of that overall piece of the pie. The gray slice is our debt service. We have a manageable debt load. It's about 8% of our total budget. The target is typically somewhere around 10%, so we're just slightly below that target. And we're projecting to stay in that general range over the next several years as we phase in the funds needed for our master capital plan. And then the last darker blue piece of the pie is is everything else, the 300 to 900 objects, the books, the supplies, transportation costs, charter school tuition, certain special education expenses, maintenance, snow removal, things of that nature. That's about 16% of our total budget. So we'll look at the budget a little differently now. Again, that was more of a look at it by account or by object, what you are buying with your money. This is more of a look at the budget from a programmatic view. So you can see categories such as regular education, special education, vocational education. Those first 5 on the left-hand side there are directly in the classroom instruction. So again, that's our core mission. So that's where we see the majority of our expenditures. Those items labeled as support services. So the bottom half of the left-hand side table and the top half of the right-hand side table are those services that are needed to support the classroom. They're not directly in the classroom, but they're necessary. So for example, support services students are going to cover your guidance counselors, your school psychologists, pupil services, support services for students, the curriculum department, library services, support services, instructional staff, the principal's office, the superintendent's office, legal services, tax collection. There's a number of items in there, and so on and so on. So as you get towards the bottom, you get into a little bit more of the things that are very important to our organization: student activities, community services, not directly in the classroom, but still, as we talk about educating the whole child, those are very important. And then the last item again is our debt service payment at about $18.7 million for next year. So this slide, I confess, I stole it from Ms. Taylor and her presentation from April 11th. It shows a longitudinal view of our staffing profile, both in professional staff and total staff. So professional staff, think of them as your classroom teachers, your guidance counselors. Total staff would include administrative staff and support staff. So as I look at this table going from 2011-12 out to what we're out to 2018-19, you see some ups and downs, but overall it's generally flat. And I think that jives well with what I showed you on the historical slide that showed salaries increasing at an annual about 0.8%. So there were some staff reductions, there were some staff adds. Primarily the growth has been in special education, and certainly that's very important work, and we need to continue to support that. So the last slide related to the 2019-20 proposed final budget is our timeline. So going back to the fall when we began the process, it shows all the things that we've completed to this point. So tonight at the board meeting, the administration is recommending that the board approve a proposed final budget, which is the second to last step in the process. We'll have a finance committee meeting on May 9th where the administration will bring forward our recommendation for the final budget. And then at the board meeting on May 30th, the board will be asked to adopt a final budget for 2019-2020. Does anyone have any questions on the 19-20 budget? How are we doing on email? Quiet? Okay. So now I'm going to switch gears to introduce to the community a notion that was discussed at our last board meeting. We've named it the Financial Advisory Committee. So this committee is an independent board-appointed group of citizens within the community who are going to be supported by Council Rock administrators. Public education is highly scrutinized, highly regulated, and it's highly personal. It affects all of us, whether we have students in the system or whether we are a taxpayer who has to help fund this organization. And because of the limitations set forth under Act 1, school districts can't simply raise the revenue that they need when they need it. You can't just go out and say you need a 6% increase because you have an enrollment spike. You're limited to what you can raise. So it's become a challenge for all school districts, including Council Rock, to figure out ways to fit inside that box. And so the thinking behind the Financial Advisory Committee is to tap into expertise that's out there in the community and have them give us a fresh perspective and a different look at how we can improve the budget process. Take a look at current practice and see if there's a way that we could tweak what we're doing, make improvements on it, think about things a little differently. Also to look at areas outside of our current practice. So there's lots of great ideas in higher education, in other forms of government. Even in the private sector, there's different ideas that we might be able to adopt, and we believe it will be helpful to have a different lens look at this budget. And so what we'd like to do is we're going to have a process whereby we seek out about 3 to 5 members of the community to serve on this group. We intend to, as we dive into some of the details of the budget, to have some folks in the bullpen, so to speak, where we might be able to bring in somebody who has expertise in healthcare or has expertise in information technology, where we could tap into some of those specialists and get their opinions on how we might be able to look at the budget differently. So what this committee does not do, though, is it does not supplant the role of the board and the administration in the budget process. So although the feedback excuse me, is very important, this group is advisory in nature, and any recommendations that they put forth can be considered by the administration and the board, but they're not binding on the district in any way. We want to just tap into that knowledge and try to improve our own budget process in the process. So the timeline for this. So this is the first official public introduction of how we intend to roll this out. So we're going to be sending out some community connections, try to get some community interest. We'll use the school district's internal email system to get the word out that we're interested in seeing your resume if you want to become a member of this committee. So Dr. Frazier and I will be charged with reviewing those resumes and making a recommendation to the board, most likely at the June board meeting for appointments, so that this committee can begin their work in the summer. Much of the work early on with this committee will be education, because the budget process is very unlike what you might find in the private sector, and there's many laws and regulations. We can't simply invest in the stock market to try to make more money, because we are precluded from doing so. We have collective bargaining agreements, which is not unusual in the private sector, but there are certainly things that we need to make sure that the committee members understand about what we can and cannot do around teacher salaries, for example, or benefit structures. It needs to be respectful of what's in those agreements. So we'll do that in the summer. It will continue all throughout the process. As we get into the fall of 2019, we'll start diving more deeply into specific budget areas. We'll begin to incorporate some of those subject matter experts that we're looking for, and the administration will begin budget development for 2021. And we also believe that it's very important that this committee sees an entire cycle of the budget process. So as we transition into the winter and spring discussions at the school board level around the budget, we'll have that group actively observing, making recommendations about process, seeing how it works with the school district, so that in the next summer, the summer of 2020 and into the fall of 2020, the committee can develop its report. The administration can then consider any recommendations that it might want to present to the board as part of the 21-22 budget process. So it's a commitment that we'd be asking for, but we believe it would be very valuable to have some new and different insights into what the budget process would look like. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Soliciting to the community interest, how would you go about doing that again?
So we will use the weekly Friday news blast. We will, word of mouth. Any way we can get the word out to the community, we will do so. Internal emails, social media, yep, all of those avenues, absolutely. Any questions on the email?
Unfortunately not.
That being the case, that concludes my presentation for the evening. I thank everyone for being here, and hope you all have a very nice evening. Thank you. Good time. Perfect.
Nice job.
Thanks.